right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
Pretty good.
Pretty good? Okay, I'll take it. My name is Maile. I work at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology in the Coral Resilience Lab. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about coral and about some of the things that are going on with coral as a result of climate change and human impact. And I love questions. So if you guys at any point don't understand anything and you want me to go deeper into anything, just let me know, raise your hand, and I'm happy to talk about it. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Is we're going to talk about one super important species in Hawaii, or group of species in Hawaii, and that is, what is this thing?
Coral.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about coral today. Now, how many of you all have ever seen coral? Where have you seen it?
In the ocean.
In the ocean, yep. What about somewhere else? You said it earlier.
The beach.
Yeah, so it's in the ocean, washed up on the beach.
In my house, I guess.
In your house.
I have a bunch of them. Me and my friend went swimming in the ocean, and then he got his leg got cut in coral.
Yeah, it happens, right? Coral's sharp. So can anyone tell me something that they know about coral? What color is it? Yeah?
It's a plant, animal, and a mineral.
All right, so my lesson's over. Coral's a plant, an animal, and a mineral. Yep, good. Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
It has the features of all three, right?
Okay, yeah. So coral has the features of all three, plant, animal, and mineral. Yeah.
It's starting to turn white because of the temperature.
And what's happening with the temperature?
It's rising.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so the temperature is rising. What's that called?
Climate change.
No, but what's it?
Global warming.
What's happening to the coral? What's that called?
Coral bleaching.
Coral bleaching. Yep. Cool. Awesome. So you guys already know a lot. This is great. And what colors can coral be?
Any color, really.
A lot of colors. Yeah. So they can be green,
White, green,
yellow, pink, purple, blue. Most of them are like browns, grays, yellows type of thing. So these are real coral skeletons that we use in our labs, and these are not alive anymore, so these are white. So there's a difference. Bleached corals can still be alive. These corals are just dead. All right, so going on to what we were saying before about how corals are a plant, an animal, and a mineral. We have here a coral polyp. And this is the animal part of our coral reef. And there's a couple features on this polyp that I want you all to pay attention to. The first of them is these things right here. Tentacles, yep. And what other species do we know of that have tentacles? Yeah. Octopus, what else? Squid. What about if I flip this thing upside down? Does that kind of look like something? Jellyfish. Yeah. So jellyfish, corals, and then one other species. Yeah. Sea anemones. Yep, those are all genetically related to each other. They're all in the same group of organisms. Those are called cnidarians. Can you guys say that with me?
Cnidarian.
Yeah. So cnidarians are all related because they have these little stinging cells on the tips of their tentacles. And those stinging cells are called, you guys are pretty smart. Do you guys know what they're called?
What's called?
The stinging cells on the tentacles of the coral polyp.
Brain cells.
Stingers works, yeah, yep. So the scientific word for it is called nematocyst. Sorry, trick question. Can you guys say nematocyst with me?
Nematocyst.
Yep, yeah, so those are the stinging cells on top of the coral tentacle right here. And then this white, or this green stuff along here, these are called zooxanthellae. And we'll talk about those later, okay? Then here is a picture of the nematocyst. So this was taken with something called a confocal microscope that basically measures all of the living things inside of whatever they're taking a picture of. So this right here, the red is all the plant part of the coral, and then the nematocyst here is that green part. Make sense so far?
Does it sting us?
Yeah, so coral does have a little like barb that can sting. Normally it stings its prey, so it eats plankton. But a lot of the time, like if you step on coral, if you brush against it accidentally, if you're sensitive to coral, then it can give you a little rash, but it's not, like the stinging is not strong enough to really harm people.
So it's like a scratch.
Yeah, it's not even like a scratch, it's just kind of like a, yeah, it'd be like a little, like if you grab onto this coral is pretty prickly, but like it doesn't really hurt, it just kind of like pokes. That makes sense? And these corals that we have here, you guys can pass them around your tables if you want. And I want you all to take a look at them and kind of observe, see what you see. And be careful, these are real coral skeletons, so just be careful with them. They're pretty fragile. No, smell it, touch it, poke it, do whatever. Don't bite it.
Don't bite it.
Not unless you want a broken tooth.
What's down here? What's that? No.
That's a little shell. So a lot of the time other things will grow on coral. Like all these are little shells. All right, if you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. You can hear my voice, say nematicist.
Nematicist.
Awesome. So what have we observed from this coral that we have in front of us?
Yeah. This one's got worms on it.
It's got worms on it, yeah. So a lot of other stuff grows on coral as well. We got some little tube worms. We got some shells. We got all sorts of stuff. Yeah, what else?
Pretty heavy.
It's pretty heavy. Good observation, yeah. Yeah, and different coral species actually weigh different amounts. So these two colonies, this one's even like a little bigger, but hold these two. Right? So this one.
This one's lighter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Looks like rock.
Yeah, that's the mineral part. They look like rocks. All right, what else we got? Yeah.
It's very complex. It's not like a hole. It's like very branching out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's very complex. It's got these little branches and stuff coming off of it. Yeah. Yeah.
It has little tiny holes in it.
It's yeah, nice. So all those little tiny holes in it, that's where all of these coral polyps live. So this is a greatly enlarged image of what lives in each one of those tiny little holes. So all of these coral colonies that you have in front of you they're pretty old. Like it took a while for a coral colony to even grow to be this size. And there's corals in like Kaneohe Bay and Kailua Bay that are the size of like car hoods. Like you know like when you lift up the front of your car. So there's corals that are that big. So think about how long it took for a coral to grow that big. All right. So we talked about the animal part of the organism. What else are corals? It's on the screen. Yeah, they're plants. Zooxanthellae, yeah. So the plant part of the coral is called zooxanthellae. Can you guys say that with me? Zooxanthellae, yeah. And the zooxanthellae is basically little bits of algae that grow inside of the coral polyp. Yeah, it feeds it. And there's two ways that corals get their food. You guys want to play a game?
Yes.
Good, awesome, I love it. So, in this game, you all get to be coral polyps. And like I was saying, there's two ways that corals get their food. The first one is they do what? They grab it, yeah. They use their tentacles and they grab little bits of plankton out of the water column. So in this game, you all get to be coral polyps grabbing plankton out of the water. But an important thing to know about coral is that they are sessile organisms. You guys?
Still.
Yeah, they stay still. You guys really are teaching my lesson for me today. This is great. So coral polyps, when they are born, they emerge from their parent colony and they basically float along in the water column until they find somewhere that they want to settle. And they just look like little grains of rice. So they'll float around in the water column and then they'll find somewhere that they want to settle. and they'll make sure that it's got the right chemical composition, and they'll make sure that it's a nice hard surface. They'll make sure that there's nothing sketchy going on in that area, and then they'll basically like squish themselves down onto their hard substrate, and they'll metamorphose into a coral polyp, and they'll stay there forever. Yeah, so in this game, you guys have to stay in your seats, right? Because you're sessile organisms, but you can move your tentacles. All right, so reach your arms up into the air for me. Wave them around. And stay in your seat, but try to catch the plankton coming at you. Ready?
I'm hungry. You're starving?
If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. You can hear my voice, say coral polyp. Coral polyp. Awesome. So, I want you all to gather up all of your plankton and count it for me. All right, what do we got? What do we got? Raise your hand. Raise your hand and tell me how many pieces of plankton you have.
5.
Raise your hand.
I got tree.
Tree?
We're gonna starve in 3 days.
5, yep. How many? 10? Yeah. 4, nice. 5. All right, so I'm hearing 10, 3, 4, 5, 17. Yeah. All right, so now you can go back to being humans again. I want you all to think about what would happen if these pieces of plankton were potato chips. But think about it. If you only had even 17 potato chips, and that was all you ate for the whole day, do you think that'd be enough?
Probably not.
Probably.
But our bodies are bigger than corals. Are they?
Well, yeah, but it's proportional. Potato chips are bigger than plankton, too. So think about it. If all you had all day was potato chips, you'd still be hungry, right? And that's kind of the same thing for coral as well. Is corals only get like 5 to 10% of the food that they eat from grabbing plankton out of the water column. And there's different types of coral, right? So there's deep water corals and those shallow water corals. And what I'm talking about right now is just shallow water corals. So, good question. So obviously they grow at different depths, right? But what else do we have more of at shallower levels? What penetrates the water more?
Sunlight.
Sunlight, yeah. So deeper water corals, because they're deeper in the water column, they don't get as much sunlight, so they get a higher percentage of their food from just grabbing food out of the water column. And also cooler water, deeper, cooler water is normally more nutrient dense as well, so they're able to grab more things. There's just more things floating around in cooler, deeper water than in shallower water.
Are they bigger?
No, not necessarily. But in shallow water, because corals have the sunlight, they get 90 to 95% of the food that they eat from a different source.
Oh, don't they make their own from the sun?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. So there's that plant part of the coral as well. And where do plants get their energy from? Photosynthesis, good. Can someone raise their hand and tell me what photosynthesis is? Yeah.
Photosynthesis is when a plant turns sunlight into their food.
Yeah, totally. So they take energy from the sun and they convert that energy into sugars that help to feed the plant. And in coral, that plant actually shares some of the sugars that it produces with the coral animal. And in exchange, the coral animal gives it back nutrients. And that's called a symbiotic relationship. You guys know that word? Yeah? What was that?
When there's multiple things working together to help each other.
Yeah, so a symbiotic relationship occurs when two animals are working together and they both get something from it. So like in this relationship, the coral plant gets nutrients from the coral animal and the coral animal gets food from the coral plant. So they both benefit from this relationship. Does that make sense? Awesome. And in this picture, you can see all of the tiny little zooxanthellae that are in the coral. So these are all each individual algal cells right here. And an important thing to remember about the zooxanthellae is that it gives the coral its food, but then it's also what gives the coral its color as well. So remember that. That'll be important later. And then what was the third thing that we were talking about that corals are? Mineral. Yeah, so corals, the coral reef structure in general is a plant, an animal, and a mineral, right? Because all three of those components contribute to the structure of the reef. And then what's the mineral part that we were talking about?
The skeleton.
Yeah, it's a skeleton. So coral reefs actually manufacture their skeleton out of the chemicals that they have in the water column, right? So like we were saying earlier, when there's just the little larvae, there's no skeleton associated with that larvae, right? So it's just kind of free floating. But then when it squishes down, it takes chemicals out of the water, calcium and carbonate, and they put it together in order to make a skeleton. And over time, that's what happens here. So when a coral polyp is floating, or when a coral larvae is floating through the water and it settles, it's just one coral polyp, right? And then over time, that coral polyp will grow, and then when it gets big enough, it'll divide. And then there's two coral polyps. And as it keeps growing and dividing, it'll make its skeleton as well. So that's what's happening here.
Basically multiply.
It multiplies, yeah. Yeah. So over time, one polyp will become 2, and then 2 polyps becomes 4, and then 4 will become 8, and then it'll just keep growing and growing over time, making its skeleton as it does that. But, everyone make a fist for me. Hold that fist up to your eyeball, and then open it so you can just barely see some light through it. That's about how much coral grows in an entire year. So it takes coral a long time to grow big enough to actually be something of this size and contribute to the coral reef.
I can barely see.
Yeah, exactly. It's a small amount, right?
This is probably like 100 years, way more, like maybe like a couple hundred years old.
I don't think it's 100 years old, right? Because as corals grow and divide, you're increasing exponentially, right? I would guess that coral is probably around like 10 years old. Yeah, that one. These are small. Yeah. No, these are probably like 5 years. Yeah. Yes.
Does the different species or like does it affect how it grows?
Good question. Yeah. So different species of coral definitely grow at different rates. Like some can grow up to 15 millimeters a year when they start off, and some grow like 1 or 2. So that's an average.
Wait, how old can a coral get before it dies?
Good question. So corals theoretically could live forever. Theoretically, right? If nothing kills it. Because it's kind of the same concept as like our hair. Like if a piece of hair falls out, it doesn't mean that we go bald. Another piece of hair will grow back in its place. And it's kind of the same thing with coral. Like even if a singular polyp dies, another polyp could divide and then take its place. And then over time, the reef will continue to grow. So the oldest known coral colony is about 2,000 years old. The Great Barrier Reef is a selection of colonies. So it's like it's not a singular unit. I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think that the oldest colony is actually somewhere in like the Mediterranean Sea area. Yeah. But that brings up a good point too, is there's different levels of coral organization. So there's the coral polyp, right, which is like just one singular thing. and then a bunch of polyps together make a coral colony, like this. And then a bunch of colonies together make a reef. So that's the Great Barrier Reef. And that's like a lot of the time if you go swimming out here in Kaneohe or in Kailua Beach, if you see coral, it's just a coral colony usually, and then a bunch of colonies together will make a reef. That makes sense? Like a lot of the fringe reef out in Kaneohe Bay, that's a bunch of different colonies together. Yeah. All right, so now that we've covered what coral is, why are corals important?
They're home to many fish. A lot of species of fish.
Yep, yeah, they're home to many different species of fish. In fact, 1 out of 4 marine species spend some portion of their life on the reef. So if we didn't have coral reefs, then 1 out of 4 marine species just wouldn't have a place to live. And reefs are also something called a biodiversity hotspot. Does anyone know what that means?
Hotspot from volcanoes?
Different kind of hotspot. Biodiversity hotspot. Yeah.
But isn't it has various amounts of different organisms, so it's diverse.
Yeah, exactly. So a biodiversity as a term means the level of different organisms that are all living together. So an area with high levels of biodiversity has a ton of different things living together. And a biodiversity hotspot, like a reef or like a rainforest, has tons and tons of different species living together. And that helps to make sure that the area is dynamic and healthy and resilient. So that's one reason reefs are important. Can you all think of any other reason why they might be? Yeah.
They make us have treatments like type of
Medicine for
cures.
cancer.
Nice. Yeah. So a lot of the medicines that we get come from compounds found on the coral reef. So for things like cancers, arthritis, infections, Alzheimer's, and various other ailments, a lot of the compounds that we have to treat those come from compounds that we find on coral reefs. And then those a lot of the time can be like artificially manufactured in a lab. What else? Yeah.
So when there's like a big storm coming, the coral will block it and take out a lot of the energy.
Yep.
So that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, totally. So corals buffer or stop about 97% of wave energy before they hit the shore. So that's like almost all of it. How many of you all like to go surfing? Or go to the beach and like to look at the big waves that are crashing kind of far offshore? Yeah, me too. I love to surf. I love to go to the beach. What do we think all those waves are crashing on?
It's coral.
Coral. Yeah. So we're in this tiny little rock in the middle of the ocean, right? And there's a ton of wave action going on around us. There's storms, there's currents, there's wind, there's all sorts of things. There's the moon, and that's causing wave energy in the ocean. And as those waves approach shore, they're squishing together, or they're squishing all of the water that makes up the wave energy squishes together into a smaller space, so that makes it go faster and that makes it rise up. And then as it keeps rising up, it can hit a coral reef and then grow into a wave and crash on the coral reef, and a lot of that energy will dissipate. Or if there's no coral reef there, all of that wave energy will grow and grow and grow, and it'll just crash right onto the shore as well. So coral reefs are really important in making sure that that doesn't happen, because a lot of the time there's roadways like Cam Highway going up to the North Shore. That's right along the beach, and there's been talk about potentially repairing that road because it is getting degraded by the wave action. Or there might be schools, or there might be houses, or especially in a big storm, we got to be careful. Yes?
How does the moon affect the ocean?
That is not a thing that I am particularly well versed in, but basically what happens is the gravity from the moon pulls at the tides and makes the tide like go in and out. Yeah. Yes? Sure, go for it. Yeah. So the coral reefs are actually really important in making sure that we have protection from large waves and large storms. If we lose the top meter of reef, so the top like 3-ish feet, damage from storms would actually double along like the near shore area. So it's really important that we make sure that coral reefs stay healthy for that reason. What else? Why else might coral reefs be important? I know you had your hand up earlier.
Was it that some types of coral produce oxygen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wait, don't some also like cycle out water
Mm-hmm.
or like cycle the water?
What do you mean cycle the water?
So I saw this video where these guys they put like this non-harmful dye
Mm-hmm.
next to this coral, and then it was like circulating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it'll cycle through the water, and it actually produces oxygen as well. Can I have everyone take a breath for me? And then one more. Why might I have you do that?
Breathe.
Yes, it is important to breathe. Thank you. Why else? Why 2 breaths specifically? Yeah.
So we could breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And about 50% of the oxygen that we get actually comes from the ocean. So that can be things like the algae in coral, that can be things like seagrasses, kelp, all sorts of things. But about 50% of the oxygen that we breathe actually comes from the ocean. So like you were saying, the corals cycle through carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, and then that contributes to what we can breathe in as well. And then it also helps to make the ocean cleaner because it's filtering through that water as well. Make sense so far? Awesome. And then, how many of you like to eat fish? Where does that fish come from? The ocean, the reef, yeah, depending on the species, it can be deeper water or it can be along the reef, yeah. But coral reefs are an important source of food for us as well, because that's where we get some of the fish that we eat. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize is coral's role in recreation. So we live in Hawaii, right? Big tourist destination. And a lot of tourists come to Hawaii specifically to see the coral reef. And as tourists come to Hawaii, what else are they bringing?
All kinds of business.
Money.
I mean, yeah, a bunch of bad things too, but yeah, for the sake of this, we got money. And money that they're spending in our restaurants, that they're spending on hotels. They're boosting the economy, yeah. So by bringing in their tourist dollars, they're helping to make sure that all of the other things that we need to survive because we live here, making sure that all of those businesses and services have enough money to stay open. And like me, I used to make my money as a coach for stand-up paddleboarding, so I did like rentals and stuff like that. So a lot of the time tourists would come and they would, rent my paddleboards or do whatever, and then I could take that money and go to the grocery store, or I could put gas in my car, or go out to dinner and make sure that money is circulating through the economy that way.
That must be a lot of tourists.
I mean, think about how many tourists come to Hawaii.
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
There's already a lot of people here.
Exactly. All right, that's a different class. Next time. But we can talk about threats to coral. And that, all the tourism in Hawaii does contribute to that as well. But what are some of the things that might be threatening coral? Yeah.
Different chemicals that come from our houses.
They come from our houses. Where else might chemicals come from that are damaging coral?
Factories, yeah.
Factories, yeah. Yeah.
Like global warming.
Global warming, yep. We'll get back to that one, that's important. What else?
Pollution.
Pollution, yeah. Air, water, what kind of pollution?
Well, gas, water, technically.
Yeah.
Like fertilizers or trash.
Fertilizers and trash, yeah. So like we were saying earlier in the Ahupua'a system, everything eventually goes down the drain, flows down into the ocean, yeah. So any trash, any fertilizer, any oil, any other sort of pollutants that are released on land eventually flow into the ocean, and that's damaging coral as well. And I know that you all have been talking a lot about climate change. So does anyone want to take a stab at explaining this photo? Your hand was up?
The that gets into the ocean and is absorbed by the ocean.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. So like cars, factories, and like cows and things, they're all releasing carbon dioxide, and some are releasing methane. And there's more methane and carbon dioxide staying in than there is going out. So it's like blocking the energy from going out.
So kind of like what Ray said, like the like from the combustion or from the cow's burps and stuff like that, the carbon dioxide and methane is trapping the sun's energy inside the atmosphere, and it's going back down to Earth and getting absorbed, and then the temperatures are rising.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
So because of pollution, there's like a lot of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, and those are greenhouse gases, so they trap heat. And so when energy from the sun comes in from the earth and it gets absorbed and it tries to go back out, it gets reflected back to earth, and it causes the global warming.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. So, like you all were saying, sun comes in, tries to go out, but because of all of the industrial processes that we're engaging in, so all of our cars, factories, houses, cows, it's creating a layer of greenhouse gases around the atmosphere. And that's making a blanket basically and trapping all of the heat.
Wait, do we basically have to kill the cows so they stop making?
No, we don't have to kill the cows.
Because they eat the grass, right? That they create the methane.
So, tangent here. There's ways that we can decrease the amount of methane that cows release into the atmosphere.
Vegans and not needing cows.
Or we could become vegans and not need cows.
I mean, do we need cows?
I think that's a different class. If we have time at the end, I can go on a cow tangent. Yeah.
Do cows like make 50% of like carbon dioxide that's getting released? Or methane? What?
Yeah, it's methane.
Yeah, they release methane.
No, it's just methane.
Okay, well that. But do they like make 50% of the methane going into the atmosphere?
I don't know that they make 50% of it. That number sounds pretty big to me, but I don't know the exact number. But there's a lot of things. All right, I'm going to get distracted talking about cows. Let's go to coral first, and then we can talk about cows later. All right, so this has only really become a problem in the last like 200 years or so, right? So prior to that, we were living without all of these industrial processes, right? So there was no real big factories. Cars weren't even invented until a little more than 100 years ago. And all of these processes that are contributing so much to global climate change weren't really present on the scale that they are. And as we're releasing more carbon dioxide, more methane into the atmosphere, we're actually making the problem worse. So we're making the blanket thicker the more that we do all this. So what is happening to ocean temperatures as the climate is changing?
They're rising because it's absorbing all of that heat from the sun that's being trapped inside the atmosphere. Right?
Yeah,
it's like
yeah. Yeah, so a big portion of the heat that is contained in the atmosphere is actually absorbed by the ocean, right? Because it takes more energy to heat up a molecule of water than it does to heat up a molecule of air. So a lot of the energy in the ocean, or a lot of the heat in the ocean the ocean is storing a lot of heat from the sun and from all the industrial processes that we're engaging in. And you can see this, right, on this chart. So we have 1880, which was around the time that the Industrial Revolution began, and the water kind of stayed, this is kind of a good like average temperature, and it stayed pretty cool for a while, and then around 1940 it kind of went up a little bit, then it stayed pretty mellow again, and then it went up. Since like 1970 it's really shot up. And it's probably just going to keep going up unless we do something about it. But why might that be impacting coral?
The coral's bleaching, and so the fish and other organisms that use coral as their food, they're kind of
Can't really use the coral anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
The coral polyps or something aren't really used to higher temperatures, and so they can't produce the food that they normally make, and so the coral expels it, and it becomes white because of that layer it just expelled.
Yeah, totally, exactly. Yes, one more thing.
What's that orange stuff in the coral?
That's a sponge. So like we were talking about earlier, there's a bunch of other species that kind of live with coral as well, and that's one of them, this little orange thing down there.
We used to like clean dishes and stuff.
Similar, different species, yeah. Uh-huh.
Can you explain how, like, what the coral does that makes it turn white?
Yeah. That's what I was going to get to next. So, what coral does, that's a good question though. So what coral does is basically, what gives a coral its color? We talked about that earlier. Yeah. The zooxanthellae, that thing. Yeah, the zooxanthellae give the coral its color. So basically what happens is as the zooxanthellae is producing food for the coral, and then the temperature gets hotter, one of the byproducts of the zooxanthellae producing food is something called reactive oxygen species. And that's just like the byproduct of something that occurs when the coral or when the zooxanthellae is making its food. So as the coral polyp is being exposed to all of these reactive oxygen species, and there's more and more reactive oxygen species because the water is getting hotter, the coral polyp is basically like, oh my god, I can't take this anymore. And it will expel the zooxanthellae because the zooxanthellae is what's making all of those reactive oxygen species. And the coral polyp might be okay for a little bit after this happens, right? It would be like if you missed a meal or two, the coral polyp would probably be okay. But if the water temperature doesn't go back down quickly enough, and if the coral polyp is unable to get back its zooxanthellae, then the coral polyp will end up dying. Because that would be like missing a lot of meals. I always equate it to, imagine you're in a hot tub, right? I like hot tubs. Hot tubs are fun. But imagine you're in a hot tub for like 8 hours and no one fed you. I would be a little grumpy. And it's kind of the same thing with coral polyps, right? Like you can survive for a while if you're in conditions that aren't super comfortable for you, but after a while like the coral polyps are not going to be super happy being in hot water with no food. But I want you all to take a closer look at this. These two corals are the exact same species, and these two corals are the exact same species. But one has been affected and the other one has not. And they're in the same place along the reef. Do you all want to help me with an experiment?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so I have here some coral fragments. And these are real corals that were used in previous experiments of ours. So I want you all to just I'll come around and just grab the first one that you see. Just go ahead and grab. Yep. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. All right, and there's 3 different species of coral that we have with us today. The first species of coral that we have looks a little bit like this. This is called a lace coral. Can you guys say that with me?
Lace coral.
Lace coral. Awesome. Raise your coral up if you think you have a lace coral. Yep. Yep.
A lace?
Lace coral, yeah.
Is lace short for something?
No, it's just called prickly lace coral.
It's called lace because it's like together, right?
It just looks like really fine like lace. Yours is a rice coral. Yeah. And yours is a rice coral as well. That's the second kind that we have. Yours is a rice coral? Yep. Rice coral. And then the third species that we have is actually my favorite. And it's called a finger coral. We'll get there, friend.
Is this a finger coral?
No, that's a rice coral. So this here, I'll wait. I did paint them blue. They're real. So this coral is my favorite because it is endemic to Hawaii. You guys know what the word endemic means?
It belongs here. It's not.
It does belong here.
It's not invasive.
It's not invasive, and it's found nowhere else in the world. Yeah, so it's native, and it's found nowhere else in the world. And you can find them all over the place here, but anywhere else in the world, they're non-existent. All right, so like we were talking about, as the ocean water is getting hotter, all right, so we have coral in our hands that I painted, but this coral still has its color, right? So it's probably going to be pretty healthy,
No.
right? Does that track?
Kind of. If it was more vibrant, it would make less sense.
What do you mean?
If it was more vibrant, we learned that when coral gets like neon colors, it's almost at the stage of death.
Yeah, okay, true. Yeah. But these corals,
They're just dark colored.
yeah, these corals look pretty healthy to me, right? Because they have their color.
They got color.
Did you paint?
But what do you think will happen if we put these corals into hot water? They'll bleach, yep.
They die.
So let's do an experiment. I'll walk around to each of the tables and ask one of you to drop your coral fragment into the water. All right, I'll start with you, friend. You asked about super coral, yeah? All right. Thank you.
It's great.
I'm gonna have you drop yours. No, I want yours. Sorry, friend. Sit down. There we go. All right, so what's going on here?
One is them not bleaching. One is immune.
One is immune, yeah. So we have a bunch of corals that turned white, right? And they did what? What is that called? Bleaching. Yeah, so these corals bleached. They lost all their zooxanthellae. But there's one right here that did not bleach. And this is what's called a thermally resilient coral. Can you guys say thermally resilient?
Thermally resilient.
You guys.
So that's what that white one is. Those two white ones are.
So the white one bleached. The white one is not thermally resilient, but this one is, because it still has its color.
It's not a pretty color.
That's the color that it is. And what this picture is showing, and what we see right here, is that for some reason, some corals are more or less able to withstand warmer water temperatures, right? That's what thermally resilient means. So this coral right here is thermally resilient. And we don't really know why that is. Scientists are still looking into it. We think that it has something to do with the genetics of the coral, but then also the exact species of zooxanthellae that it has inside of it. So different coral colonies will have different zooxanthellae inside of it, and then that's what makes the coral more or less resilient to climate change. What do you think will happen if we put a coral back in cooler water?
It would just like restart. It would restart.
I think it stays the same.
So if the water temperature goes back down quickly enough, then the coral is going to be able to regrow its zooxanthellae.
Is it turning dark blue again?
It's turning dark blue, but it'll take a minute. I did paint it.
What kind of paint did you use? That's so cool.
But pay attention to this coral polyp. I mean, this coral, pay attention to this colony. So this colony, listen up. So this coral colony, this coral fragment is turning back to darker blue, so it is regrowing its zooxanthellae, but it's happening much more slowly than when it bleached. And it's the same thing in nature too. So coral does have the potential to survive if the water temperature goes back down quickly enough, but it's a very slow process for corals to recover. Like it can take 5 to 10 years for corals to completely recover from a bleaching event. So it's going to take a long time. But as the climate is changing, bleaching events are happening more and more frequently. So that means that there's less of a chance for corals to recover in between bleaching events. And then that's going to be detrimental to the overall health of the coral over time, right? It would be like if you had to run a marathon and then someone came up to you and was like, all right, go do that again. You'd be like, nah, I'm not doing that. Let me go home, let me rest, and then maybe next week I'll do it again. It's kind of the same thing. We're asking coral to run marathons without giving them enough time to recover. And then this is an image, again, of the confocal microscope of bleached and non-bleached corals. So this one over here, it's got plenty of red. And what did we say the red was? Zooxanthellae. Yes. Say that with me, Zooxanthellae. There we go. So the Zooxanthellae in this one are present, right? There's a ton of Zooxanthellae, so they're probably pretty healthy. This one over here has got a lot of negative space.
It's a lot darker.
It's a lot darker, and you can see that the tentacles too, they're not.
They're kind of like stuck there.
Yeah, they're kind of like, they're a little sad. And this is on a global scale, right? So climate change is occurring all over the world. So it's not just corals here in Hawaii. It's not just corals on the Great Barrier Reef. It's corals all over the world that are being impacted by climate change. And that's all because of stuff that we're doing, right? So then that raises a question of what can we do? We were talking about cows earlier. And cows, I will go on my cow tangent quickly. But there's ways that we can actually reduce the amount of methane that cows produce. And I'm not going to say one way or the other, or whether we should become vegan, where we should get our meat from, anything like that. But if we feed cows the diet that they were evolved to eat, so right now a lot of the time cows are fed corn or soy because that's cheap for humans to produce to feed them. But they grew up eating grass and things like that. So they won't produce quite as much methane if they eat things like grass. And then some research has also found that if you feed cows seaweed, they actually produce very, very little methane. So there's ways that we can tweak the system that we already have in order to make it better. But then that's just one thing that we could maybe do to change our impact on the environment. What else can we do? You guys have any thoughts? Yeah.
We can use less like electricity.
Use electricity and just use less in general, I think is a good thought. So like, what about trash? When you throw your trash away, where is away?
In a garbage dump.
In the garbage dump, yeah. But a lot of the time, all of that stuff that we're throwing away isn't getting used for anything. So like one example I like to use is when I go to the grocery store. Is everyone listening? When I go to the grocery store and I see those big bags of oranges already in a plastic bag, I'll go and pick the oranges that are just floating loose by themselves, right? Because there's like oranges already come in a container, right? They come in a peel. You don't need to put them in another container. So I'll grab the loose oranges so that instead of supporting a company that puts their oranges in a plastic bag, that plastic bag doesn't need to get made anymore, and I can just have my oranges. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome.